Good evening and welcome everyone to another fabulous evening with Raphael Chacon. We are so delighted to offer another program in association with Over There, Montanans in the Great War, and we are open until December 16th. We'll be open the day after, wait a minute, is Thanksgiving on Thursday or Friday? Thursday. Thank you. We'll be open Saturday from 12 to 3. If you have guests in town, we invite you cordially to come and partake. We want to offer special thanks once again to our wonderful sponsors who made this exciting and unique exhibition possible: Destination Missoula, the Tourism Business Improvement District, retired Colonel Tom Ross, Washington Corporations, the Bill and Rosemary Gallagher Foundation, Western Montana Military Officers Association, Lowe's Home Improvement, Montana Public Radio, Bitterroot Flower Shop, and our wonderful champion members. We also want to thank our great lenders to the and Amalia Atopoulic. Where are you? Atopoulic. I always say that wrong. I apologize. There you are. Thank you so much for all the wonderful material you lend us. Thanks also to Paul Thomas and Keith Harden, who's here with us tonight. Thank you, Keith. Tom Ross again, the Gilbert Milliken Art Resource Center, and Betsy Bach as well. So before I introduce Raphael, who really needs zero introduction with this crowd, let me remind you that we have more programming coming up in association with this show. Dr. Harry Fritz will present for us on November 30th right here in this space. And then there's another World War I movie in partnership with the Roxy Theater. That's on December 4, which is a Monday. And finally, Dr. Lisa Simon will present on the topic of poetry during the World War I era. That is December 7th. It's been phenomenal to work with Dr. Raphael Chacon as our guest curator and catalog author. He spent 6 years planning this delightful and powerful exhibition. He is the professor and division coordinator of art history and criticism in our School of Art and holds an A.B. in art from Wabash College. He received his MA and his PhD degrees in art history with honors from the University of Chicago. He's a specialist on Renaissance and Baroque art and teaches a broad range of courses on the history of art and criticism, both within and beyond the European tradition, both at the University of Montana and with Mali. His research interests are predominantly in architectural history, historic preservation, and the development of art in the inland Northwest. He is the 2007 recipient of the Dorothy Ogg Award for individual contributions to historic preservation, and he published a book in conjunction with our museum back in '08 on the life and work of Montana architect A.J. Gibson. That book entitled The Original Man, The Life and Work of Montana Architect A.J. Gibson. He's also published seminal articles on the art of Glacier National Park back in '09 and in 2010, and has studied the art associated with medieval and Renaissance pilgrimage routes in Europe, and has walked the Camino de Santiago in Spain and France, not once, but twice. He's lectured abroad on topics as wide-ranging as contemporary public arts projects that go viral, to the history of flags. Last week was a flag lecture, was it not?
It was.
In 2014, he delivered a TED Talk on genetic testing in family history, and finally, and most recently, he was named among the top 10 lecturers of the Smithsonian Institution's prestigious Journeys program. That is a big deal. All that said, here he is, Dr. Raphael Chacon.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Welcome, everybody. You folks must have prayed to the parking gods, because you're all here on a very, very busy night at the University of Montana. Thank you for being here. I greatly appreciate your presence. And we have a birthday in the house, so I think we should give a round of applause to Mr. David Morganroth sitting right here in the corner, please. So this has been a wonderful project, this over there, and it's in some ways war is always an unsavory topic, but it's a powerful subject and one that we need to address and redress and continue to engage. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk about the Over There exhibition, this marvelous project that is here at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. If you haven't seen the exhibition, I want to invite you to spend some time there and maybe come back. We still have a month left, and by the way, there's a grave error on the screen. Can anybody spot it? The closing date, thank you, Herbert Swick. The date is actually December 16th, so you have 2 days less than what the screen says to see the exhibition. But again, if you haven't seen the exhibition, I want to invite you to spend some time with those objects, because they are poignant, marvelous, wonderful, challenging things in this exhibition. So, thank you to the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, its staff, for allowing me the privilege of doing this exhibition, working with them. Thank you to the students who are out there who are very, very seriously engaging this material in your coursework as well. So, what I aim to do this evening is to broaden the conversation, because obviously in an exhibition like this, with a topic as multifaceted as World War I is, the Great War, you cannot cover every aspect of this very significant moment in world history. So the exhibition, in fact, touches on many subjects, and it touches on them lightly. This is a museum of art and culture, so obviously the exhibition has both of those elements. But in some ways, the exhibition leans toward the cultural side of this conversation. There is indeed great works of art in the exhibition, and so I want to address those. And so for the first third of the exhibition, roughly third, what I'm going to do is revisit the ways in which art intersected this war, and so talk a little bit about the way the topics that we chose to address in the exhibition, the way that the works of art that indeed are addressed by the exhibition itself. And then for the second part of this lecture, what I'd like to do is actually broaden the conversation about the arts in general, and that is how the war impacted the visual arts and how the visual arts impacted the war. In fact, when I was working on the title for this thing, I chose the Latin because, you know, most people don't know what it means, and it's just an impressive Artis et Belli, but one can translate that in a couple of different ways. It is the Great War and its art, but it's also the art of the Great War, or it's about the art of war. That's another way of translating it. So this is a war in which art played a significant role, and it's also a war in which which impacted the visual arts in a very substantial way. And so that's the conversation that I'd like us to engage, and it's one that admittedly this exhibition does not engage. So the idea of these lectures, myself, my lecture, Harry Fritz's upcoming lecture, and Lisa Simon's upcoming lecture, is in fact to broaden the conversation beyond the exhibition itself. So what we're going to do is talk about some of the ways, some of the works of art in the exhibition that indeed bring this topic of art and war together. And the first one, of course, is the propaganda poster, of which there are many in the exhibition, in no small part to Hayes Otopolik, who lent us from his very, very rich and dense collection of World War I posters. The poster was a significant piece of the propaganda war, and in fact, World War I is really the first war in which propaganda, the poster, the work of art, was in fact seen as a weapon of war. We had posters, we had certainly had recruiting, the poster as a recruitment tool before the war, but in this war, the poster becomes in earnest a weapon, an ideological weapon. And so these posters function on many, many levels, and I'm just sort of scratching the surface with this list here. The posters were clearly recruitment tools. They were meant to, in fact, garner support for the war and to certainly bring new soldiers into the effort. Secondly, these posters conveyed ideology. That is, every empire, every nation that participated in the war developed its own set of posters, its own set of images that conveyed its values in the war, its role, its particular stance. The third point is that these posters were obviously intended to raise funds. Most of them were and this is why there were so many, millions of these posters were printed up. And they were basically displayed in just about everywhere you would turn, you would see these images. Because in some ways, all these armies had to raise, all these governments had to raise funds in order to make the war function. And finally, it was a way of demonizing or depicting your enemy. So not only could you depict yourself and your values, but you could obviously do that to the enemy. And in some cases, the posters themselves were meant to demoralize the enemy. And so they were also, the poster was an effective way, using the visual arts again, but as propaganda, as the message that the government wanted, in fact, to promote. So many of these posters, and I'm not showing you, these posters are not in the exhibition, but they give us a sense of how these posters functioned in the early days of the war. These happen to be, that's a Canadian poster on the left, and I believe the one on the right is a British poster on the right. So clearly the topic of preparedness and the sense of recruitment, using the poster itself, the image of the poster to recruit soldiers to the effort, was a major, major part of this effort. And of course, the best posters are the ones that spoke directly to their subjects, to the people. So this idea of pointing at you, or actually, I don't know what this guy's doing on the left. He's sort of winking you, cajoling you to join the service. Not the most effective gesture, but nevertheless, it's that direct appeal that made some of these posters highly successful as recruitment tools, and recruitment in the broadest sense, not just simply recruiting soldiers, but in fact bringing everyone, the entire population, to the cause. So these are actually some of the most effective posters that were developed in the war. And this is, of course, the British poster that was so successful in the early years of the war. And of course, this idea, as with many ideas, came across the Atlantic to the U.S., and of course, it manifested in this poster, James Montgomery Flagg's famous "I Want You" for the U.S. Army, with the iconic image of Uncle Sam. This is, by the way, today the most recognizable image from World War I, universally. So clearly it was a very, very successful poster, which had, in fact, that idea of the direct appeal, a device that is continued to be used today in the war poster. Okay. One of the things that we tried to do in this exhibition is to have a couple of posters from before the U.S. entry into the war, that is before April of 1917. And in fact, what those posters show us, in fact, that there was a completely different strategy prior to our entry to the war as far as recruitment posters. The one on the left is a U.S. Army poster that basically has a very benign imagery. The soldiers look rather lackadaisical, like this, they're just going about their business. There is really no direct appeal. In fact, you would only be swayed to go if you were interested in the hardware, right? If you were interested in the gear or interested in dashing uniforms, right? So that's a poster from before the war, and we have one that's very, very similar to that one that's on the screen in the exhibition. And then we have also this image on the right in the exhibition, and this is actually after the U.S. entry to the war. And it's a very, very different visual and aesthetic appeal, as you can tell. Clearly, the poster has impetus, it has energy, it's a much more aggressive image in many ways, and it contains all of those elements that I just discussed in that opening screen about the poster. It is a recruitment tool. It's also intended to sell war bonds, as you can see from the base. It has American values. It has iconography that's readily recognizable to any American in this great land. So the strategy changed, and of course that changed because of this man that you see there on the left. This is in some ways our propaganda minister. This was a man who was hired by Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, in fact, to coordinate the propaganda during the time of war. And in fact, it's his Committee on Public Information, the CPI, that in fact generated the thousands of posters that we see today and we identify with American posters during the Great War. That's, by the way, the committee there. And so those are the individuals who are largely responsible for the posters that we identify with the war. And some of the posters actually in the exhibition, you will actually see the stamp of the CPI in the lower right-hand corner. So clearly the poster changed dramatically, and it's in fact a convergence, if you will, of the visual arts, because clearly artists were being employed here. Artists themselves were being recruited for this effort in creating a new weapon, and this was in fact a visual weapon, and a highly effective visual weapon. So another American poster from those early days of the U.S. entry to the war. And then, of course, these posters really appeal to all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that if you do a survey of these propaganda posters, what you see is that they're in a range of visual styles. Many of them sort of look like they could have been designed by Norman Rockwell. But some of them are more modernist, more abstract. Others are more literal and illustration-like. Some of them were pitched to children. Some of them were pitched to women. Some of them were pitched to older folks. And many of them, of course, were pitched to men of service age. So there's an incredible range here. And of course, we have a standard set of iconographic symbols and subjects that, of course, become the topics of these posters. In this case, it's the Statue of Liberty in two very, very different guises. And the Boy Scout poster on the right, and that poster on the left, which Lady Liberty yakking on the phone. Today she'd be like, texting or something. Okay. So, and the appeal, in fact, was broad, very, very broad-based. I mean, the whole point of this was to reach every single American, including groups that were arguably Americans. In fact, what you see that's very interesting about this poster is if you read the names, Dubois, Smith, O'Brien, Seika, Hauka, Papandrikopoulos, Andrazi, Vilotto, Levy. The whole idea here was, in fact, to reach communities, immigrant communities, who were arguably American, who basically, many of these communities saw themselves as Italians, or they saw themselves as Jews, or they saw themselves as Greeks, not necessarily as Americans. So this is, in fact, an era when the poster itself reached out to these communities, and in fact, Americanized them all, as the poster says. We are all Americans in this effort. And of course, in many ways, the most powerful thing that these posters did was to clearly say, we are us, and this is why we deserve to win this war, and these people do not deserve to win this war, and in fact need to be stopped. And so identifying, characterizing, and in some cases mischaracterizing the enemy was intentional. And the whole point of that is you have to remember these posters are art, yes, but it's propaganda. So it's art with a message. It's art with an intention. And in this case, demonizing the enemy was a very, very important part of these posters. So this is actually, I think, one of the most effective posters because it does it subtly. I mean, it tells us that Germans are, in fact, bloodthirsty militarists, right? And they need to be stopped, and they certainly need to be kept off our soil. So these posters were also very, very effective at that point of arguing that the enemy was, in fact, should not win this war. The second most popular image that these posters, the second most popular icon of World War I is the Hun. And this is a fictional character, much like Uncle Sam is a fictional character. The Hun was, in fact, a characterization of the German as a savage barbarian, as a brute. And of course, this stung the Germans greatly because, of course, they saw themselves as one of the most rational, civilized countries of Europe. They thought that their empire deserved to win because of the high degree of civilization and culture that they fostered in the early 20th century. This image was meant to undermine that notion. And it portrayed the German soldier as, in fact, almost a beast, less than human. And that, of course, these posters, the creation of the Hun, unleashed a demon in our world, and that is the concept that the enemy is not worthy, that the enemy is not one of us, is not even human, and certainly their behavior is less than human. And that's why this image was so effective in World War I. So in many ways, the poster really is the largest representation of the visual arts that we have in World War I. It was used by all the armies, all the great empires had their artists working for them, and basically the messages were very similar, even though the aesthetic strategies might differ from army to army. So, but the poster is indeed the most identifiable art image of the war, but you have to remember it's not really art. At least not in the sense that we think of art as a free, expressive medium. This is, of course, propaganda art. It's art in the hands of a state that is highly controlling both the image and the text with a cause in mind, and the cause is winning the war. So it's art, but it's art that in some ways is skewed in the context of the war. There are other sort of manifestations of art in this war too, and some of it is really kind of unusual and strange, but also wonderful. I consider camouflage one of those. Camouflage is in some ways an art form. It's a tool that is used by armies today to disguise gear and uniforms and weaponry and to disguise our soldiers in battle, in the field. And World War I is really the first case in which camouflage was used on a grand scale. Camouflage was invented in the 19th century. It was invented by the French, right along with the French fries. Actually, no. The Belgians invented French fries, and they remind you every time that we're calling them French fries when they're really Belgian fries. But nevertheless, the French invented camouflage. And actually, there's evidence that camouflage has been used by Native American peoples, that there are traditional societies have used camouflage. Certainly in nature, nature uses camouflage all the time. Animals constantly disguise their appearance by blending into their surroundings, their natural surroundings. Well, the French in the 19th century developed a version of this, and then by World War I, they actually created a division that actually studied and experimented with this and actually created some very interesting devices. The other armies picked up on this idea in a kind of ad hoc basis. We certainly in the United States also used camouflage, but it wasn't official, it wasn't actually standard issue stuff. But our soldiers used it, and they made it. And they, in fact, camouflaged just about everything, all the gear that they had. So it was an idea in which, interestingly enough, the visual arts and the war converged. So what I want to talk about is some of the objects that we have in the exhibition that are indeed camouflaged. And then I want to talk about its connection to modern art, which I think is actually quite intriguing. And then finally, I want to talk about the Navy's use of this. And that's a topic that we don't address in the exhibition, but it's an important version of the camouflage story. So this is French camouflage. The French actually came up with some really interesting stuff. I mean, they were actually hollowing out trees. They were creating artificial trees, much like cell towers today that are, saguaro cactuses that are actually cell towers. Well, they were doing this to hide their soldiers and to hide their equipment and their gear. And they actually were very active in this field. And the other armies imitated them. And they created their own versions of these things. It's quite an interesting story, the idea of camouflage in the French army. But really, the way that we mostly see camouflage is in objects like these. For example, this is Colonel Tom Ross's father's helmet, which he camouflaged himself during the Great War. There are many, many, many versions of this. And it seems that almost as if every soldier sort of invented his own version of camouflage. They got the idea, the concept, bold outlines, geometric shapes, patched together to look like trees and shrubs and leaves and that sort of thing. And then the use of multicolors to, in fact, break up the form of the helmet to indicate that there was a human being behind or wearing the object. So it's a very interesting art form, and it's basically a homespun art form for these soldiers. They invented it as they went along. And they didn't just do it on small objects like helmets, they also did tanks. And these are Keith Harden's tanks in the exhibition, or his models of tanks. These are French, German, and English tanks, and you can see some of them were indeed camouflaged. And there's a range of styles for this camouflage as well. So it's an interesting art form, and again, it's kind of an ad hoc art form that sort of a residue, if you will, of the war. And for the most part, it didn't have a kind of official status. Okay. We in the United States actually had a dalliance with camouflage in World War I, and it's a very interesting chapter, and it involves women, incidentally. There are a couple of ways in which women participated in the war, and this is an interesting chapter as well. We had this institution called the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps, and it was part of the Department of the Navy. It started as the National League for Women's Services in New York and in Philadelphia. It had 40 members. Women had to pay to do this, to join this branch of the service. They had to pay $43, which was a lot of money in 1917. But what they did was, in fact, they experimented with camouflage, and they invented their own versions of it. And some of the best documented examples were showpieces that they did in New York Central Park and also in Van Cortlandt Park in New York City. So here are some of the photographs of this organization. Now, if you can't see the women here, the camouflage is working. There is a pile of women on the right there dressed up as rocks and trees and shrubs and dirt on the right. So they were designing uniforms and outfits and painting them to mimic the landscape, in fact, to mask, in fact, the body of the soldier in the field. But I think the projects that were most interesting were these, and these were demonstration pieces of how camouflage worked. And so these are some of the examples, and I apologize for the graininess of the photographs. There aren't really any good photos of this project out there, but certainly the press recorded it because it was an intriguing subject for New Yorkers and Philadelphians when this crew went out there to paint a tank. in camouflage, as you see here in these photos. Or, well, actually paint a horse. Actually, I'll let you read the caption there. This is called the camouflage steed. I've often heard of the horrors of war, but I never expected to be one. I think that's the mule talking there, the camoed mule. But this was actually one of their more popular projects, which in fact they painted a battleship, an old junker of a battleship in New York Harbor, and there you see the Corps actually camouflaging this thing. Actually, what they're doing is they're dazzling a ship, and the term dazzle was in fact invented by British artists. And these artists, actually there is one individual, Norman Wilkinson, who's identified with the invention of dazzling, with actually the use of the term. There are actually two artists who were Cubist artists, that is that they were modernists, who understood the breakup of form and this modernist design. And they thought that this would be a good thing to do to battleships and the British merchant marine, the merchant fleet. And so the idea here was in fact to disrupt the outline of the ship, because the most visible way of knowing whether that's your ship or an enemy ship is its outline. And there's another thing that you look for when you're looking at a ship moving across the ocean. You're looking to see how fast it's going and in which direction it's going. And dazzling, that is applying camouflage, and by the way, these are black and white photos, so you don't assume that these ships were painted in black, gray, and white. They were dazzled in multicolors. I mean, these things look like exotic tropical birds. The idea was, in fact, to prevent the enemy from knowing what kind of ship it was, where was it going, in which direction it was moving, and how fast it was moving. So the surface, especially the bottom, where this boat sat in the water, which is an indication of how fast it's moving, how heavy it is, which direction it's going. That pattern was meant to disrupt all of those things, so that one, in fact, couldn't identify the ship itself. This was dazzling, and it was quite, arguably effective in preventing ships, the loss of ships, particularly in the Atlantic. The United States did dazzle a couple of its warships, and certainly the British spent a lot of energy and money dazzling their fleet. And so this is, in fact, one of those strange places where the war literally converged with the modernist art, that is, the abstract art of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, with Cubism. So this is the work of a Cubist artist, a Russian artist by the name of Alexandra Exter. And these are the kinds of patterns that you were likely to see dazzling these ships. And in fact, here are some of the drawings. These are anonymous, so there was in fact a whole division of the British Navy that in fact basically came up with these patterns and then executed them on their ships. And then there are also many, many patterns that were never executed because they just never got around to doing them. So, camouflage, dazzling, certainly the poster art. These are, in fact, the arts that are readily identified with World War I. The third art that's very easily identified with the war is trench art. And that, of course, is art that's not made by professional artists. It's, in fact, art made by soldiers, laymen, the individuals who in fact, were untrained but had time on their hands and obviously access to materials. So this is the art of the trenches. It's what's generally called trench art. And I think it was Keith Harden who said that World War I was mostly, 99% idle time and 1% death, terror, horror. And I think that's probably true. Most of these soldiers, in fact, basically sat around a lot, and they waited a lot in these trenches. And some of them used that time, in fact, to make what we would call, arguably, works of art. Of course, now this is made mostly in the hand by individuals who are not trained artists. So this is in that category of untrained art, what used to be called naive art or primitive art or even outsider art. It's just art made by local yokels, the common individuals. And so it's art that has artistry, but it's arguably, works of art. So anyway, this is in fact that idle time in the trenches, recouping time, but the trenches were also horrible places, obviously. And so these are just a couple of photographs that show you what life was like in these trenches. And still, in this kind of industrial setting, in this horrible setting, people found time to humanize themselves and humanize their world. And I think that making art was, in fact, a part of that process of humanizing their circumstances. This is also a very, very interesting, a chilling photo. This is actually, you know, what the battlefields were like. I mean, millions and millions of spent shells were literally littering the battlefields. And this is the stuff that was transformed into works of art, what we call trench art. Of course, you have to remember, this is the first grand-scale industrial war. So these objects were intended to kill, and once they were detonated, once they were exploded, their remnants were literally lying all around the field. And so the soldiers used it, and they in fact spent a lot of time and energy putting on these objects the things that mattered the most to them. The names of their divisions, the names of their platoons, the names of their cohorts, the battles in which they fought, the values that they believed in, their loyalties, their allegiances, those things which mattered the most. I think of these objects as, in fact, very poignant objects. In some cases, this may be the last mark that was made by a soldier on this planet Earth. So they're not insignificant. They're also not just merely documents. They are, in fact, artistic statements made at the end, in many cases, of someone's life. So they are very powerful things. And of course, they convey all of the things that matter to them, including the girlies. So here's some more evidence of these soldiers and the things that, and they weren't just working with spent shells. They were making a whole range of objects with what tools and materials they had around them. And by the way, almost all the armies did this, at least the armies that were in trenches themselves. So these are two of the objects that are in the exhibition. They're exquisite objects on many, many levels. This is only a part of a much larger a piece of trench art, one that I would invite you to go visit if you haven't already seen the exhibition. There's a mandolin on the left made out of a soldier's helmet and leftover parts, musical instrument parts. And these are others. These are not in our exhibition, but they give you a sense of how important values were in personal values, religious values, patriotic values in trench art. There's a spade on the left and a crucifix on the right made out of bullets. This is the bottom of a shell casing cut, flipped upside down, hammered, beaten into a cap, an officer's cap. And there's a few others of that genre. Okay, so those are some of the objects that you're likely to see in the exhibition here, along with the camouflage and the posters that in some ways are a convergence of the visual arts with the Great War. I want to talk a little bit about the impact that the war had on the visual arts in general. Obviously, the war disrupted all of life in Western Europe, and it certainly disrupted life here in North America and in all the colonial empires throughout the world. It was indeed a great war. It touched just about everybody on the planet. And it greatly disrupted the visual arts, and it did some very, very weird things to the visual arts. I like to think that in many, many ways, World War I also revived art forms that had already been dead and buried by 1917, at the start of the Great War. For example, academic art, that is the art of the grand European traditions of the 19th century, had been pretty much eliminated by the early 20th century. And World War I actually revived academic art. And this is the evidence of it. So the grand history painting with the hero as the king of the hill, those images we identify with not the 20th century. We identify them, and we certainly don't identify them with early modernism. We identify those images as the strategies of storytelling in the 19th century in the visual arts, in painting. This is, by the way, a Canadian artist, Richard Jack, painting his masterpiece. And in a minute, I'll show you that image. But this is, let me just say right off the front, much of the art, the official art of World War I is retardataire. Okay? That's a nice French word for retarded. And I mean literally retarded in the sense that it is, in fact, very old-fashioned stuff that had already gone out of style, certainly by the teens. And so what you have here in World War I, at least in the official art, is a revival of 19th century art forms for the purposes of telling the story again, the story now of this great war. So remember that in 1907, this painting had come along and had completely transformed the visual arts in a modern direction, in a modern bent, in a way, in some ways, away from storytelling in a traditional way, toward abstraction, right? Towards form, towards color, towards line, towards those formal elements. That had happened 10 years before the start of the war. So to see paintings like this revived on a grand scale and to see people putting a lot of energy and money into this, this effort was in fact putting energies into an art form that was already very, very old-fashioned. So here, this is another, well, this is the painting by Richard Jack. It's called The Second Battle of Ypres. From the battle took place between the 22nd of April to the 25th of May, 1915. And this is in fact grand storytelling a la the 19th century. In some ways, the early 19th century, because there's a great deal of romantic painting in something like this. This is an art form that's now 100 years old, being revived for the purposes of telling the story of World War I. And could artists have used that to tell the story of World War I? Certainly, but how many people would it have reached? Probably like 10 in New York City, maybe a couple in London, maybe one in Missoula, I don't know. Nobody in Missoula. It's this stuff which people understood in 1917 or 1919. Okay? So no matter how old-fashioned it was, how retardataire it was, it made sense to, in fact, bring back academic painting. And so much of the art of World War I is, in fact, academic. And it's, in fact, very, very traditional, very old-fashioned, if you will. And in fact, it continues to promote the idea that you want to tell a story, you want to tell the story well, you want to have clearly identifiable heroes, you want to know who the heroes are, who the good guys are. So there is that element of propaganda, and remember, this is official art, governments are paying for this stuff, right? So that there's a crossover then between the propaganda poster and then the oil on canvas paintings that in fact commemorate now the events of the war. Academic art. I think in some ways this is the last gasp of academic art. That is, if you don't consider Thomas Kincaid, you know, a viable artist. Okay. This is actually probably the John Singer Sargent's last gasp. And I use that, oh, I shouldn't say that, because the painting is called Gassed. It's a horrific image of soldiers who have been recently gassed, sort of leading each other, the blind leading the blind, so to speak. But it's in some ways, it's John Singer Sargent's last great impetus to make his particular visual style relevant and current. And the war allowed an American academic painter a chance to kind of make his case again. But remember, there's this guy called Picasso out there. There's a bunch of modernist artists who in fact say, look, this is no longer a viable way of telling, it's no longer a viable means of representation in the visual arts. But at least in the context of the war, it made sense. And so commissions like these, John Singer Sargent's or Richard Jack's, were very, very important. People still needed a good story, and they needed to see that story and have that story be completely legible to them. And so this style made sense in 1917, 1918, 1919, and even into the 20s. But admittedly, this art is illustration. And its function is, in fact, to heroize and idealize and to clean up the messiness and the horrors of this war. So this is a British painter, Septimius Edwin Scott, and his image of a medical officer attending the wounded. This couldn't be more radically different than a Picasso portrait, a Cubist portrait. Still, I do think that in spite of the fact that there were, in fact, hundreds of artists, academic artists now in the field, recording the war through watercolors and sketches and to a certain extent in oil paintings as well, I do think that they are also responsive to modernism, and in some ways they are responding to modern art, and they are aware of modern art, and in some cases they understand that their art is in fact in an old-fashioned style, that they're doing a very old-fashioned thing through their watercolors and their sketches and their drawings. And I think the catalyst for the changes in the tradition of academic drawing and painting is photography, because the photograph is out there in the field actually doing the recording. And so in some ways, if you have photographers taking photographs like this, why do you need artists to do it in charcoal drawings? But what's interesting to me is that the artists who are using traditional academic materials like charcoal drawings are responding to the photography. For example, I don't know if you can see how an image like that on the left, this charcoal drawing, is in fact responsive to a photograph like the one that you see there on the right. And in fact, in some ways, academic art changes as well because of the horrors of this war, and maybe even what photography is recording. These artists are much more likely to draw an unheroic image like we see here on the left than a heroic one. Now, whether these drawings actually eventually made it into paintings or whether the hero becomes a hero again in the final work, I'm not so sure of that. But at least in these drawings that were done in the field, you actually sense that these drawings are reportage, that they're really recording, attempting to record what was actually happening. So we tend to think, for example, that only in the Vietnam War, when you have television recording the actual events of the war, what was actually happening in the field, that then Americans become aware of how horrible war is. Well, there's an instance here in World War I where artists were, visual artists, academic artists were attempting to do that, and certainly the photographers were doing that, trying to be more balanced in the kind of story that they were telling through their works of art. So I do think that images like these, which look less than heroic, are actually responding to not just the actual events of the war, but they're also responding to photography, trying in essence to compete with the photographic image. This is an American artist drawing in 1918, showing artists in the trenches and of course destroyed gear and animals in the scene as well. There is this weird fascination among these army artists because most of these artists that I'm showing you in fact worked for the army. It's a fascination with technology, with the new gear, the new equipment, and in this case it would be the tanks. And so it's weird, if there's a hero in these drawings, it's not necessarily the soldier or the doughboy as we see in the poster. It's in fact the gear, it's the technology. It's the tank is the new hero. And so you have these kind of wonderful and strange images, almost I think of them as sort of Star Wars-like images of these new technologies rolling across the landscape, and they seem to be the heroes of this war on many levels. Here's another one where you've got German soldiers trapped underneath, and check out the camouflaged hats or helmets that they're wearing. But the hero in this image is not an American soldier. Well, presumably there's an American soldier, but he's inside that tank, or an Allied soldier, I should say, inside the tank. But it's the tank that's the hero here. Isn't that interesting? And eventually you have paintings. In this painting here, this is called On the Trail of the Hun at Saint Mihiel by an American artist. Who's the hero in the picture? It's not the doughboy charging the hill. It's that gas-powered lorry. It's the truck is the hero. I mean, imagine the days when trucks were heroes. And actually, the Soviets loved this idea. And in fact, I'm showing you two posters from the Soviet Union in that post-war period in the 1920s that, in fact, lionized the traktor. Nothing like your heroic tractor. Okay. So again, academic art, whether it's drawing, painting, is in fact has a resurgence in this war, not just among artists who worked for the armies and for the government, not just in the propaganda pieces, but also the artists and the sculptors who would commemorate battles and heroes and losses after the war itself. All of this stuff is, again, retard-a-terre. It is the revival of 19th century art forms now in the 20th century, mostly in the second and third decades of the 20th century, for the purposes of, in fact, commemoration and recording and memorializing the events of the Great War. This one is probably familiar to all of us, right? We've all seen this before? It's downtown at the courthouse. We have, in fact, the most popular statue of World War I. There's two versions of it designed by two different artists, John Paulding and Ian Bekesny. Both came up with rival images of the same subject, that is a heroic doughboy charging a hill with his weapons, and in some cases holding a grenade like you see here on the left. And there are multiple copies, hundreds of these in cemeteries and public squares and public institutions all around America, most of them put up in the 1920s and the 1930s. To commemorate the Great War. Most of these, by the way, were funded by local citizens and local clubs and people raising, putting pennies in a jar in order for these sculptures to be made. It is, in fact, the most significant image. But again, it's storytelling, it's recognizable, it's representational art. It is not modern art. It's not contemporary art by any stretch of the imagination. It's, in fact, the continuation of formulas that go back to the 19th and even earlier than that, the 19th century. So in our exhibition, we actually have Hayes' version of this. He has actually a desktop version of this, and this was designed by Ernest Moore Viquesney, who was sort of the rival. Viquesney did a very clever thing. I think at some point he knew of John Paulding's design of that figure, and then he made his own version of it and then ran to the patent office and patented it. So he got the patent on this image called Over the Top. And that's, of course, and then he scaled it up, from small versions all the way to life-size and slightly over life-size bronze sculptures. So he's the one who made a killing on these sculptures and popularized them all around the country. But again, these images, these ideas of the heroic soldier on a plinth is a very, very old-fashioned formula for the 20th century. Certainly for the second, third, fourth decades of the 20th century, the period in which most of these monuments were put up. Here's some other ones. I'm just showing you a kind of a smattering of these monuments in this academic style from the early 20th century, from the second quarter of the 20th century. And some of them are most of them are quite beautiful and poignant and moving in many ways, although ironically many of these images have lost their currency because people don't know this war very well or have very few personal associations with the war. This is a very interesting monument. This is in Chicago, and as you can see, it has two dates. The original, the bottom part of it, was built in 1927 without the doughboy on the top, and it commemorated an African-American regiment, the 8th Regiment of the Illinois National Guard, which fought in France, and that's what the bottom of the monument commemorated. But then at some point, somebody realized that it needed a little bit more storytelling, and so they added the doughboy in 1936 to the top of it, and that completed the image. And again, it's a very old-fashioned formula. Most of these monuments are really dull, really boring, and I'll be just frank with you. They are, in fact, some of them are quite beautiful and lovely and well-designed, but they're really actually quite boring things. So you can't blame people if they just walk past them, unfortunately, because in fact it's a very tired formula for monuments made in the 20th century. This one's at Yale University on the lower right, and I believe that one on the left is in France, but it's an American monument. Okay. So there are, in fact, some spectacular instances of these monuments, these commemorative monuments, where modern design, modern values converge with these themes. And they're hybrids. Admittedly, they're hybrids. They, in some ways, continue this idea of storytelling visually, clearly, but they also have modernist touches, modern design to them. And I think these are actually quite powerful monuments themselves. This is a Canadian monument. That it's called the Saint Julien Monument, and it refers to a battle the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. It's a Canadian monument, but as you can see, there is in fact a soldier here, but it's abstracted. And certainly the traditional separation of the bronze monument sitting on top of the plinth is now merged into one. So the soldier becomes the plinth becomes the soldier. A very clever device on the part of this Canadian designer. Here's that monument again. So these are hybrids. They are what Alfred Barr, the curator of the Museum of Modern Art, would call near pure art, near abstract art. It's in some ways wanting to be in two worlds, wanting to be in the 19th century on the one hand, but also in the 20th century on the other. I think the greatest monument of this ilk is this building and sculptural ensemble in Kansas City. This is the National World War I Museum. It's also called the Liberty Memorial. It's the official World War I museum for the United States, and it's in Kansas City today. It is just a huge granite phallus, literally. Actually, it's a torch. There's an eternal torch at the top of this thing, but it's a very interesting monument, and it is our official World War I monument. It's not in D.C., it's in Kansas City, of all places. It also has a spectacular museum kind of underground. In fact, this is the entrance to the museum below the monument itself, where our National World War I Museum is located. So it is a very impressive complex of modernist architectural and sculptural design. There are, at the top of the torch, are these sculpted angels that you can see here. They're sort of Art Deco or Art Moderne abstracted angels at the very top of the thing. And the part that I like the most are these sphinxes. They're two grand, huge sphinxes, but they're so ashamed, sad, mournful at the war itself that they have covered their eyes and their heads with their wings. It's a very powerful image, these abstracted sphinx-like forms near these two little pavilions at the top of the monument. In one of those pavilions is actually a very interesting piece of academic art. This is called the Panthéon de la Guerre, which is the Pantheon of War. This is 7% of a huge panorama that was made in Paris. It was 402 feet in diameter. Imagine, it was the world's largest painting. And it was eventually purchased, broken up, cut apart, and it was reconstituted at this place in 1957. So what we see there today is 7% of the original painting. And this is just one section of it that's in Kansas City. I'm just going to show you a couple of these. Again, this is academic art. This is 19th century ideas warmed over for the purposes of telling the story of the war and the aftermath of World War I. And that's located in this monument. Here are some other scenes of it at that monument. Okay, so I just want to finish up here by looking at the trajectory of modern art, how the way that the war impacted modern art directly, especially the traditions of abstraction in modern art. So we're going to look at its impact on the avant-garde, that is the abstract artists and the expressionist artists of the early 20th century. In many ways, the war literally ended movements because it ended the lives of significant artists. This is, for example, the German expressionist August Macke, and this is the kind of work that he was doing in 1912 before the war. So he was a German expressionist working in this abstract, cubistic, expressionistic style. August Macke died in action in Champagne, France on September 26, 1914. He's just one of many, many artists who literally lost their lives in the war. The most famous German expressionist was Franz Marc. These are the kinds of paintings that he was doing in 1911, 1912, these abstracted animals in this cubistic language. Franz Marc also died in World War I, a huge loss to the art world because he was a very young man when he died at Verdun in 1916. The futurist artist and one of the fathers of Italian futurism, Umberto Boccioni, the creator of this amazing cubist sculpture, futuristic sculpture in 1913, and drawings like the ones that you see here. He will also lose his life in the war. The futurist movement lionized, glorified the machine. In fact, one of the great maxims of the Futurist Manifesto was a racing automobile is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, an ancient Hellenistic sculpture. The argument here is that the machine age has arrived, and many of these futurists loved the battle. They loved going into war. They celebrated the war, and you see that dynamism in their abstract drawings, like Boccioni's drawings that you see here in the upper right and the lower left. So Marcel Duchamp, of course, that impetus, I think we can see that, and how that impetus will in fact impact the dynamic designs of the futurists like Boccioni. Here's another drawing by Boccioni. And Boccioni actually will die in World War I in an accident, not in warfare, but nevertheless, he was a soldier at the time, and he died at the age of 33 in the war. In some ways, ending the movement, the futurist movement. And there were collateral damage in this war, obviously. So this war impacted the lives of artists directly, even if they themselves weren't soldiers or lost their lives in the war. This is a portrait of a photograph of the American painter Marsden Hartley, and this is probably his best-known painting of all time. This is actually a portrait of a German officer. We know who the individual was. It was Karl von Freiburg, that he commemorates in this painting. Karl von Freiburg was Marsden Hartley's lover, who lost his life and he was a German. So this is an American artist who had befriended a German officer who lost his life in the Great War. And so this is his homage, if you will, to his dead lover. And probably no other artist was more impacted by the Great War and its losses than the German expressionist Käthe Kollwitz. She was a pacifist. She opposed the war. She did not support the German Empire both in World War I or the German Reich in World War II. In World War I, she lost her youngest son, Peter, the guy you see there on the right, in 1914. And this is how she commemorated World War I. This is actually the cemetery where her son and his colleagues are buried in Vladslo, Belgium. And of course, there is no sense of heroism in this sculpture whatsoever. And I don't think this is just an image of German defeat. I think this is a mother who actually felt the loss in a very, very profound way, a mother who also happened to be an artist. Now, here's another image of that cemetery today. So this is a German cemetery in Belgium where her son is buried. And of course, the story continues, and it has a very sad and ugly twist in it, because she loses her son, Peter Kollwitz, her youngest son in World War I, and she loses her grandson, Peter Kollwitz, in World War II. So, for many artists, especially modernist artists, war was in fact folly. It was the end of Western civilization as they had known it. And so one of the great themes that we see among modernist artists is the idea that war is in fact horror, and that civilization has really come to its lowest, its nadir, not its zenith, its nadir in the war. And so many European artists, modernist artists in fact, attempted to in fact describe this war as an inhumane event, as a folly, as a useless activity. No matter what the politicians said, no matter what the armies and the generals argued, this they saw as in fact an unacceptable collapse of human civilization. So this is the Austrian artist Albin Eger-Linz, and this is called The Nameless. He depicts the soldiers as in fact nothing but machines, killing machines, nameless, with not just a loss of names, but a loss of individuality. And here, so this is painted in 1916. 10 years later, he's still painting this theme. So this is his Pietà. So the idea of, you can see that the war has actually impacted this artist in a very direct way. This is the work of Anton Kollig, who was an Austrian artist in World War I. Mostly he did portraits, an artist who was arguably a modernist. These are sort of part modern and part old-fashioned, but these are the kinds of things that he was doing during the war. Depictions of generals, soldiers, his patrons, the politicians of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in its last days. But again, he was a modernist artist, and so there's this painting here from 1911 that shows us the kinds of academic studies that he was doing, but also in some ways, this is academism with a twist, modernizing, update some very old themes, like a nude youth that evokes in some ways an ancient sculpture of Mars, the god of war. But notice how stunned this young man looks. He's not exactly, a confident warrior here. He is, in fact, almost shell-shocked before the war has even begun. And in fact, this idea of depicting the male body, especially the nude male body, becomes a controversial subject in the Great War, particularly among the modernist artists. Why? It's because the body, the healthy, robust, beautiful body, is in fact going somewhere, and it's being used. And how is it being used in the Great War? If not as chattel, if not as a weapon, if not, its ultimate destiny is in fact a death. So this is the artist Sweetenkamp. I believe this is an American artist. In fact, he's saying, why are we in fact producing and growing and training and educating these young male bodies, if in fact really their ultimate destiny is in fact the grave? So there is a sense of doubt about these bodies, and of course these bodies couldn't contrast more with the heroic image of 19th century warriors. This is probably the most indicting image that we have of this idea of the body. This is a German artist, Georg Gross, or George Gross as we call him in English, and this is his famous Kriegsdienstverwendungsfähig. What the doctor's saying is that this one is in fact fit for active service. So Gross is arguably a pacifist. He commented on just about every aspect of German life during the Great War, was highly critical of his society, including its warmongers. And this is a cartoon that is clearly meant to, in fact, indict the men running the war and the people who were cooperating with it. So to him, this idea of preparing a soldier for war was ludicrous when you consider the millions of men who were losing their lives every day. So these images, these sort of protest art, couldn't contrast any more vividly against the war monument, which in fact heroizes, lionizes, aggrandizes the beautiful body, the beautiful heroic body. A body which would be maimed and broken and severely mutilated in the Great War. I have photographs very similar to this, but I thought I could not show you those photographs. I mean, if these drawings turn your stomach, as they should, the photographs are even worse. So these are an English artist, Henry Tonk's drawings of mutilated soldiers in the Great War. So I think that George Grosz, a modernist artist, in fact, was not just responding to modernism and its values, he was responding to the very real world around him and the circumstances of that war and making these very, very powerful indictments of that war. Now, that artist that I just pointed out, the portraitist Anton Kollig, who drew that nude youth, continued to do these nude youths, but there is almost a kind of despondency among these individuals. And I think it's because the artist is aware that this is a generation that, in fact, is lost. There is an attempt here to say, okay, this is a beautiful young man, right? A beautiful body, an ideal, perfect body, but what future does this body have in these circumstances, in this warfare? And it's really not until the 1940s when the message for him, for Anton Kollig, becomes overt. And so these are his paintings in the 1940s that literally link this beautiful body to death itself. And that tradition, in fact, I think impacts the visual arts pretty profoundly. And it's continued by artists like Francis Bacon, who will continue to do this idea of the maimed, disturbed, broken bodies. And I believe that Francis Bacon understood that from the photographs that he saw in the Great War. Here's a painting of his from the 1950s where we see literally a face that looks like the kind of disturbed and maimed and mutilated faces of soldiers in the Great War. But really the great theme to impact the visual arts is this idea that war is dystopia. And so the idea that we could in fact live in a wonderful, fresh, green planet was really was railroaded by the Great War. And so the most powerful image to come out of modern art after the war is this concept of our universe has become a form of dystopia. In some ways, these paintings read like apocalyptic images. They're prophetic of the kinds of things that you see in sci-fi films today or science fiction novels. But this was, in fact, the landscape of the Great War, and this is what these artists, in fact, confronted in the world around them. This is the work of Paul Nash, the English painter Paul Nash, and his paintings have been compared to Picasso's Guernica, the famous anti-war image from the Spanish Civil War. So this is a painting called The Void from 1918. And this is called We Are Making a New World, 1918. What kind of a world were we making in the Great War? German artists also did this, so it wasn't just Americans and English and the Allies who were responding negatively to the war through the visual arts. Certainly the movement of Dada, which is a predecessor to Surrealism, they basically argued life has no sense, life has no meaning, the universe has no order. So for a German artist, coming out of one of the most rational, linear cultures, to make art like this, literally cutting, snipping, splitting, throwing things together, showing us a chaos, a world in which order has imploded, is, I think, a statement about the conditions in which Germany found itself in the post-war period. Dada was nonsense. The world was nonsense. And this interpretation will profoundly impact the visual arts in the 20th century. And certainly the child, the spawn of Dada, is of course surrealism, and that idea that the world is in fact topsy-turvy, that the world is upside down, that the world is in fact chaotic and irrational or surreal, is in fact what artists like Salvador Dali will continue to argue for the rest of the 20th century. And so I'll end with this painting here, which is not a World War I image. It's actually a painting from 1937, from the height of the Spanish Civil War. It's a painting that is also retardataire in terms of style, because Pablo Picasso revives a style of painting, this Cubist language, some 30 years later, in order to make his version of war, in this case the Spanish Civil War, but maybe he's also making a statement about war in general. And I believe that the way that Picasso revives Cubism for the purposes of this propaganda against war in the 1930s is not unlike the way the World War I revived academic art in order to make its case some 20 years earlier. So on that note, I will end. But now before I give you actually some suggestions, if you're interested in this concept or this evolution of the visual arts in World War I, there have been a couple of already significant exhibitions starting in 2014 that address art and war, mostly in Kansas City, but there are a couple of them that are beginning to open shortly. There's one in Philadelphia, which is also continuing in New York City at the New York Historical Society. The Metropolitan Museum has just opened a World War I art exhibition, and the Smithsonian has an ongoing series of exhibitions in 2 museums starting in April of this year and continuing through November of next year. So if you're interested in this topic, and if you get to Washington, D.C. or New York City, check out these exhibitions. Okay, that's it. Barb, how are we doing for time? Can we take some questions?
It's 20 to 7, just so you know.
It's 20 to 7. Okay, are there any questions out there? Or comments? Did you buy my argument? Yes, Anne.
I'm wondering, the shell art that we're looking at, what were they using to manipulate the metal?
You have to remember, these guys had tools. I mean, this is war. This is a battlefield, so they had tools, all kinds of materials, presses, vices, hammers. So much of the work that you see here is the French call it repoussé, so it's actually beaten with hammers and other sharp metal objects. Some of them are incised, engraved, and so that's a very different technique, but most of them is just pounding. And there's actually there's a German diary of a diary of a German soldier where he talks about that sometimes in the quiet of the battlefield, all you could hear on both sides from opposite trenches were the sound of hammers pounding.
But you know, in trench art, what we call trench art today, it's also different for different countries, because like the Turkish people in their trenches, they did lots of beating with beads.
Right.
And a lot of German units painted shells and painted artillery shells. So it kind of varies at different things and what kind of mediums. And
That's right. In fact, much of the trench art we have in the United States actually came from Belgium and France, obviously because our soldiers spent time there, and they picked up trench art as souvenirs from French soldiers who, put their themes and their ideas. In fact, some of the works here were probably made in France, maybe even by French artists or Belgian artists, and were picked up by American soldiers while they were there. And there is, of course, a cottage industry that develops around this stuff that even post-war. So an industry that was making souvenirs for these soldiers and their families, in many cases coming over to repatriate bodies and that sort of thing. And they were picking up these souvenirs and bringing them to the States as well. And there's a great range and variety of these objects. So thank you, Hayes. Maggie?
Some of the soldiers make these for themselves to take home?
Oh, yes, certainly. Yes, and in some cases we know that there were a small cottage industry developed here. So there were armies, and they knew that certain people had certain talents, and so they would go to them, and I want this image on that shell, and personalize it for me, engrave my name on it, engrave my divisions or my units information or their monikers on these images. So most of them are highly personalized. Whether the soldier did that himself or whether he had it done for him, that's a good question.
I recently came across a piece of trench art. It's only half finished, and it was being made in a cottage and a shop. And the soldier rushed probably back there, and the artwork wasn't finished. And he wanted it. He's leaving. The ship's going home.
Right.
It's disembarking for America. I mean, they're loading the ship, and he goes, I got to take it anyway. So he just takes his half piece.
So did you pay half off for that one?
At any rate, the guy that told me he's not a stripper with these tools, so he just finishes it by hand painting the design on it. It's only just half finished.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. So you have engraving done by one artist and hand painting by another. Yeah.
He painted himself. And I came across another one recently, and it was a piece of, you know, the Black Forest artist that carved these beautiful clocks and, you know, all this stuff in Germany. Well, in this one area, there's these wood carvers, and here all of a sudden there's these Marines occupying the ground in the winter of 1918, 1920, and they see the 2nd Division patches with an Indian hat on them. So this Black Forest wood carver, he carved a nutcracker in the face of an Indian.
Wow.
And then he carved in it all this name of this Marine and all this stuff, because, hey, you know.
So a Bavarian artist would adapt his traditional wood carvings to themes that he's picking up from these American soldiers. That's very interesting. Yeah, yeah. Like I said, trench art is very, very diverse, very interesting stuff, and unique and unusual for the visual arts at this time. Yes?
Was that
Tracy?
painting by John Singer Sargent, was that commissioned or did
Yes.
he? Okay.
That was a big commission piece for him, and in some ways it was important for him because his style had gone radically. His work was radically out of style and out of fashion, and he was hard up for support at that point when he got that big commission for that painting of Gast.
I got another question.
Sure, Hayes.
What is, after World War I, there was a movement that was called trash art of the Great War. What was trash art?
So that's not trench art; it's trash art.
Right.
Huh? I don't know. I actually don't know if how trash art was identified with the war. Do you
Oh, I know.
tell us what is it?
It was sold, you know, people that really didn't have any real formal art training, and they started producing paintings. And they call it trash art. You know, it's like, you know, these pieces that are made out of, like, people say them popsicle sticks. And
Right. It's outsider art. Yeah.
I'll show you these ones. I'm not saying these are.
Okay, sounds great.
It's all trash art.
Next exhibition we do, right?
Terrible. This is terrible. But it's done by a World War I soldier. It's very interesting.
Excellent. You learn something every day. Trash art. I had never heard that term. Very interesting.
Great War. Someplace I got an article about.
All right. Okay, folks, thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Enjoy the exhibition. We'll see you at the next one.